Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting back into our talks about Powers of 10, so we're now at this point we've now reached issue 5 out of 6, and Jonathan Hickman has given us so much information to digest, it's insane. And mainly because there's so much to talk about even in between the lines of the main story that's taking place in each issue. And because of Hickman's style of writing, we're given just enough in each issue to kind of prime us for what's around the corner. And he does this with House of X, unfolding the story very slowly, but with Powers of 10, like we're talking about today, Powers of 10 gives us a much broader scope from start to finish, which of course overlaps with the other events we see unfolding much slower. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so previously in our other playlist where we had talked about the events unfolding in House of X, we eventually discovered how Charles Xavier was using the 5 to genetically replicate your physical host of any mutant that he had a sample of. But this process that we had seen, which takes place well into year 10, it only produced a shell which they call the host, which they could only manipulate by aging the host however old they would desire them to be, which was preferably after an age where their mutant powers had developed. But in order to give these hosts a soul, like we talked about in the previous video, Charles Xavier will have to upload their memories into these host bodies from this newer version of Cerebro. And so now in Powers of 10, where we start back again with year 1, but just a little bit further along, from Charles meeting Moira, learning about her previous lives, then taking that and sharing that truth with Magneto, and then after that, Charles leaving with Magneto and making Mr. Sinister bring forth discoveries that he eventually would according to Moira's previous lifetimes. But when Charles and Magneto met Mr. Sinister, Charles gave him a bit of a nudge in order to make it happen sooner. And so now in Powers of X, where we see Charles Xavier speaking the Forge and more or less asking him to upgrade Cerebro, this is something that was supposed to eventually happen throughout your traditional history of Cerebro, which almost makes it feel like Jonathan Hickman is nudging us with the idea that what we had seen take place when Charles originally asked Forge to update Cerebro, that this had happened in one of Moira's previous lifetimes, which is likely where Charles got this idea. But this time around in the 10th life, and once again breaking all the rules. And with this time around when Charles meets with Forge, which I also think is a little bit earlier than it should have been, but this time around when Charles meets with Forge, he proposes the idea of Cerebro not only being able to track down every mutant, but also back up their minds and essentially back up a sentient being. And this is something that we knew about before within Powers of 10 and House of X, with us first learning about the Sinister Betrayal event, and then more recently in Moira's 10th life, we've seen Charles kind of copy that in order to produce a very similar result, but this time around using the 5 in order to do so. But the thing is, when Charles initially brings this idea to Forge, initially he thinks it's ridiculous, but he then mentions to Charles that there's two problems with this concept, with one being redundancy, and mainly because over the years people change, and not just mentally but sometimes because of circumstances physically as well. And with Forge suggesting this is why when we get to year 10, when all of this is placed into action and the rules are created like we talked about in the last video, when to duplicate and when not to, this is why Cerebro was set to back up everyone's mind once a week, and this is why they had the need for redundancy. But also with this issue, Forge mentions that you have the population of mutants growing every year, to where at this time it's prior to the incident in Genosha when millions of mutants lost their lives, and at this time Forge knows nothing about this, but he's just running back at Charles some of the logistics of how big this request truly is, which brings up the next issue, which happens to be the fact that there is no hard drive on this planet that is big enough to hold that amount of data, and especially with Charles saying that whatever that amount is, that he needs that times 5. And at this point Forge just takes a sip like, yeah, oh, okay. And I could just imagine like in his mind he's like, well can we figure out one first? Because once again he let Charles know that there's not a hard drive that big on this planet, but at this point Charles has already figured out that this could be resolved with the help of the Shi'ar. And so now later on, eventually we'll see that this will be done with the use of Shi'ar logic diamonds, because later on towards year 10, when this process is fully functional and the rules are set in place and Charles Xavier is doing his weekly backups of all the mutants, in addition to that, once a year he'll dump off all that information and do a hard backup onto these logic diamonds, which he has hidden in separate locations. And if I had to make a guess, they'll probably resemble the object that we'd seen Apocalypse back up Nimrod's origin data on. And I mainly say that because back at the time in Moira's 9th life, the surviving mutants, which were just under 10,000, they had taken refuge within Shi'ar space. which just shows us once again, he's using ideas from hundreds of years in the future in order to solve the problems of today. Breaking all the rules, man, and it don't stop there. And so now also in year 10, both Charles and Magneto go to meet Emma Frost. And when they get here is when we begin to learn about the Quiet Council of Krakoa, which in my opinion sounds like a newer version of the Hellfire Club, and not in any kind of nefarious way, but much like the Hellfire Club, to whom Emma Frost is still involved with at this point, where she sits in their order as the White Queen. And they sound alike to me because the Hellfire Club is a group who collectively uses their influence to manipulate politics, to manipulate the economy, and doing so really just for the benefit of themselves. And so when Charles and Magneto meet up with Emma here, they ask her if she's heard about this new drug that's gonna shut down pharmaceuticals altogether, and with her being connected, she's like, yeah, sure, I've heard of it. And essentially Charles just tells her, yeah, that's us. But in the instance of the nations, like we talked about in the last video, who declined Krakoa's independence, this is the conversation before that, because it's here that Charles tells Emma about Krakoa for the first time. And at this point, which is year 10, which is post Genosha, when Emma hears this idea, she's immediately like, oh, Magneto, I know you know better, putting all the mutants in one spot on an island again, where they will likely be killed again. And she's not wrong for thinking that, because that's exactly what it sounds like, a setup for the genocide of Genosha all over again, which essentially makes her beg the question, what is going to be different this time? And it's here that they both show her by actually taking her to Krakoa, which is really the selling point once she actually sees what they're doing. And it's also here where they make the offer that when the time comes and some nations decline, and some will because later on she'll tip the scale, but they didn't go too obvious and just try to mind control the whole world. But as for the nations in the red who decline, Charles and Magneto are proposing to her that she be the face of their legitimate trade, and air quotes on legitimate. But with her being the face of the brand, they would offer her 2 seats so that her and another, so they could successfully smuggle these plants to another country and offer the mutants a way out so that they can make their way to Krakoa. And so now at this point, the Quiet Council is very much in its early stages, and we do know eventually it will seat 12, but we don't know as of yet who are the 12 who will have those seats. And so for Emma to do this, Charles and Magneto offer her 2 seats in 20 years, which I guess is however much time for however many people to hold however many seats. But she's not content with the 20, so she gets Magneto to bump it up to 50, but then she's curious, why are they offering 2 seats? And it's here where Charles lets her know that the other seat is for Sebastian Shaw, who she's reluctant to bring back since she just got rid of him, but she does agree to do so under the condition that she has a 3rd additional seat, to whom at this time we just don't know who that 3rd person is. And so now after this, when Xavier sends out the invitation to the mutants around the world, now that he's made provision for them to make their way to Krakoa, this is like your initial invitation, which was made possible through more or less Professor X drug smuggling, with the previous plans that he made with Emma Frost. And this is one of those things to where we've learned, like in House of X, that the whole process of bringing mutants to Krakoa in its entirety, it had its different steps, because initially you had some who were personally recruited, much like what we talked about with Cypher, but many of these initial recruits, they were more so brought in order to set things up and even prepare Krakoa to make this possible. And as we had seen later, when mutants would arrive, this would happen in different waves. So it's not like Professor X just asked one time and everybody said yes. And I feel like Tomi Shishido is a perfect example of that, because in Powers of 10, when we see him kind of walk away from Xavier's invitation, we know because of what we've seen in House of X that eventually he does change his mind, and eventually he does accept, even though he's like the leader of a death cult. So I guess at this time he was just open to trying new things. But this also begs the question with people like Mr. Sinister, who when we see him getting this invitation, he's packing up and he's coming immediately. But in his case, it wasn't necessarily much of a choice, because we had seen Xavier once again breaking the rules and pushing Sinister's influence back in year 1 when he made him collect mutant blood samples and focus heavier on mutant genetics, and it made him forget this until a day that he would tell him to remember. And so when he invites Sinister to Krakoa, in the case of Sinister, it's more like he's being activated in year 10 to continue the plans which Charles had planted in Sinister's mind back in year 1. And so what I also like about this invitation is that we get to see the invitation going out to Namor, who at this point in time is well over 100 years old. And I feel like when it comes to every big event, you have to have a part where someone goes to Atlantis and they ask Namor for help and he tells them to just get out of his face, because more often than not, that's his answer, which is something that we've seen more recently within the War of Realms. But what I like here about the way that he turns down Charles, and at this point Namor probably feel like a broken record, man, but when he tells Charles Charles, what I like about this is that when he tells him to leave, it isn't because he disagrees with what Charles is doing, but rather in these early stages, Namor just doesn't believe that Charles is serious. Because Namor, he's been doing this longer than Charles has been alive at this point, and he's been fought and tested, and he's still standing. And it's for that reason, when Namor is given an initial invitation, he declines, and he tells Charles to come back when he's serious, because he needs Charles to prove to him that this quote perfect little island is more than just the dream of a child. But that'll do it for this one, guys. So now, if you can tell, I've kind of been trying to save like everything with Ascension in year 1000 to do like closer towards the conclusion of Powers of 10, and mainly for the purpose of just consolidating all that information, much like how I did in the beginning of the House of X playlist when I went through the previous lifetimes of Moira McTaggart, at least the ones we know about, and how that jump started House of X. And with that, I wanted to do something very similar with the Ascension in Powers of 10 in year 1000, just so I'm not throwing you guys all over the place. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Leave your thoughts below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.